Mr. Ferreira. I'm going to be talking you through another video. This week, I'm hoping to put two videos out to you and for you to do some kind of comparison between the two different risk factors. The fourth risk factor that they name in the specification is family influences. Now, of course, I'm hoping that before we even think about this in a greater depth, that you would understand that family can have both genetic influences and also social learning, and that there will be kind of aspects relating to kind of both of those. This particular risk factor is related more to the social aspect of things, of kind of how your family in itself could be a risk factor. It's quite obvious if you think about it that if you grow up in a household which either encourages something or discourages something, it may actually ultimately kind of determine kind of where you are on that particular behavior. So let's look at some of the content that we need to have a look at. As I said in the beginning, social learning theory is going to be an obvious thing here. Okay, so what we see here is that we learn through observation. Now the key to this is observation. And we do know that it's vicarious learning, so therefore we learn the punishments and rewards linked to the particular addictive behavior. So we can say quite obviously from the start that if you are in a particular family that kind of participates in addictive behavior, you are most likely or more likely to imitate that particular behavior in a social context. We have some kind of research that kind of backs this up, and it says that, you know, looking at specific gambling behavior, that particular behavior is imitated. Now, what they did look at is a number of different families and looked at things like routines. Okay, and what they find here, I think, is quite interesting. It says that what happens is that they were hearing what family was saying about gambling, talking about their particular experiences, and what happens is they eventually join in. Now, this does kind of make sense, because if you don't know anything about gambling, like I'm not familiar, for example, with gambling on football, other than the mere concept of a win or a loss or how many goals are going to be scored. However, if you grow up in a family that constantly talks about it, you see other people kind of doing the particular gambling behavior, you may eventually join in. And certainly I would say, in my experience when I worked at a race course, that this may well be the case, that after a while you kind of know kind of what's going on and you do join in. Now, of course, that's the one side, social learning theory, the imitation of behavior. The second thing that they ask us to look at is this actual, how do parents themselves influence the particular behavior? Okay, so this is saying once you've started a particular addictive behavior, your parents or a parent or guardian's manner with you may determine whether it persists. Now, you might have read stories or seen films, or it might have been something that's happened to you about somebody potentially who gets caught smoking, and then their parents force them to smoke a whole packet of cigarettes in order to make them feel ill. It's kind of like this type of behavior. How do your parents actually kind of behave when they find something out about you? So exert the influence on the offspring's addictive behavior. So I'm going to think of a hypothetical situation. Okay, it certainly was more relevant perhaps when I was at school than when you were at school. But if, for example, I've started smoking, and it's quite obvious in terms of my uniform that it does smell of cigarettes. Okay, maybe my parents have asked me about it, and I've said, oh, you know, Billy Bob, my friend, smokes, and it's a secondary smoke and things like that. Okay, but maybe I put my uniform in to be washed and I forget a packet of cigarettes in the pocket. Okay, so I know that that packet of cigarettes has been found. Now, a parent could ignore it, or they could challenge me on it, or something along those lines. Now, of course, you could say then if they ignore the packet of cigarettes, they're in some way are condoning the behavior. So you can see how parental influence can be actually quite complex, because sometimes it's the absence of behavior that may give us encouragement. Maybe it's a parent who says no or doesn't say no that could actually ultimately influence you. So in terms of the theory, there are two ways that they can influence you. The first one is going to be social models. Okay, there's some obvious things, a bit of social learning as well. Like, I'd be a bit of a hypocrite if I told my children that they can't do something that I'm doing myself. Okay, so obviously in terms of gambling, in terms of drugs, in terms of smoking, you can see quite obviously children are likely to model my behavior. Okay, so therefore, if you have substance abusing parents, you're more likely to also go on to substance abuse themselves. Okay, to kind of help us understand this, we also see that this could well be down a gender route. Okay, so this particular research was on gambling, and it was kind of male to male, female to male transmission. And he said here, males typically experience gambling through their fathers and females through their mothers. Okay, and we see that the types of gambling and the activity that they do was pretty much down to what their male or female parent was doing, their gendered parent was doing. Okay, this may not be intentional. It could be other social constraints. It's quite easy to fall into those gendered roles without being too prescriptive, but you can see how potentially turning to a particular male or female role model could certainly influence your sports betting in this particular case. Okay, so that's modeling the type of behavior. Now, the second one is this style of parenting. Now, this may be something that is quite close to home for you. How does your parent actually control? Okay, so we find this idea, as I said, if a parent finds some cigarettes in your blazer pocket, what do? How do they intervene? Okay, and we find that parents themselves can influence your addictive behavior potentially by how they show what they are considered as being important. Okay, and so in other words, how do they relate or react to you? Now, Fletcher says here that an authoritative parent, okay, so this is not the authoritarian personality or the authoritarian that we saw in social. This is just a parent who has authority, okay, that perhaps has earned the respect, is kind of a good parent that shows warmth, okay, and control, okay, could shape a child's life, their resilience and emotional well-being. Okay, so this is a very kind of difficult job to do. So what it's potentially saying is saying that if a parent knows how to control a situation, kind of is able to point out rights and wrongs with a degree of warmth, okay, the child may then pick up resilience and well-being, emotional well-being from their parent, and so therefore have low levels of substance abuse. Okay, we're talking about risk factors here. Okay, so clearly we can see that somebody is less vulnerable if they have a type of parent that pretty much kind of understands who they are, how to be a parent rather than a friend, and is able to kind of connect with the child to build resilience and emotional well-being. Okay, it's not saying that they won't become substance abusers, but it's saying that there's a good chance that they're able to kind of work things through. But of course, as many of you are very much aware, not every parent is able to do this, and certainly most parents can't do this all of the time. Okay, so just as it's self-explanatory, but if I'm not that type of parent, then I'm not able to kind of help my child. So I do feel perhaps, a lot is being said here without me writing too much. Okay, so for example, as I said, the opposite, maybe if I'm authoritarian and I demand respect and my child doesn't behave in a particular way, that could lead me to poor resilience or poor emotional well-being. Or if I don't control the situation, if I'm a parent that lets a child do whatever they want to do, then of course, we do know some of those parents. That's often parties are there, they'll buy the alcohol and things like that. Once again, substance abuse is more likely. Okay, so you can see this is quite a positive, and that's why I put it in my notes rather than saying, oh, it's all negative. If parents are kind of terrible, then their child has got no hope. But obviously, I hope you appreciate that this is quite difficult to do. Now, looking at the evaluation points, what we do have is evidence, lots of evidence out there. So saying things like the family characteristics were most strongly associated with increased prevalence of binge drinking. So in other words, if, for example, instead of having a parent who takes control or kind of decides right and wrong, but they allow children to get whatever they want to, or they have particular siblings that are allowed to kind of do particular behavior, it says they're strongly associated with prevalence. Which is quite a kind of an interesting piece of research. And so then what it is just doing is almost kind of stating something which I think many of you are quite familiar with, that if you do have tolerant parents and you have peers who smoke, you're more likely to have a situation where your behavior is endorsed, in other words, given approved of, and so therefore you're going to go back and repeat that particular behavior. Now, I've decided to put a counter here in my own evidence, okay, and I found this particular point quite interesting, going back to this idea that sometimes the absence of parental influence is often an issue, and it says due to lack of parental influence, it says it is possible that alcohol and drug use may be a result from a withdrawal of parental involvement. Okay, now before you start getting all parents are awful and all this type of stuff, it can be very difficult for some adults to kind of see their children kind of growing up and changing. And sometimes it's easier to ignore something than actually to face it. It's not necessarily a parental style that I would recommend, but you can obviously see how it becomes a risk factor, that if I'm not talking to my children about relationships that I see on TV or drinking alcohol, smoking, or taking drugs and stuff like that, the chances are that they're going to be more vulnerable. Okay, we have research here from Sutton and Kerr that says that lack of monitoring, okay, also could result in an adolescent, for example, disclosing too much information about their substance abuse to parents, and then of course the parent, it says here, parents' inability to deal with this information may actually be a problem. Okay, so many of you may have had this experience as well. If you do tell a parent kind of how do they respond to it? Also, once again, very difficult. Now, I suppose we're talking about often behavior here where you're kind of moving from being kind of teenagers into adults yourself, and you can understand that potentially some of the things that you may share, some of the things you may say to a parent may actually be quite difficult for them to deal with, and I would kind of argue could be a result of them not having dealt with their own kind of understanding of being a parent. So it says here the consequence of this is that they're vulnerable to peer influence. Okay, and I suppose this should kind of make sense to you, that if a person is not being parented by a parent, the chances are they'll turn to other people who will influence them and parent them. Now, this is not a very big points, and that's kind of why I've coupled it together with the other one. But I'm hoping that you can see how, if I'm starting to kind of tick those boxes of kind of things that may make a person more vulnerable to addictive behavior, that parents can be kind of incredibly important. We'll see in the next one, we'll look at peers. And so we're kind of linking this, we're going to link this together with peers at some stage, and you can see how they could almost, if anything, have a much greater influence on family. I hope that you found this video accessible, and we can talk about it this week when we have our Google Meet lessons. Thank you, and bye.